There's a very interesting problem that we run into when we start to look really far back into ancient humanity's past. I mean, there's all kinds of problems that pop up, obviously, when we start to go back then. But there's a problem that exists with respect to studying ancient history that most people don't even know exists, and even fewer attempt to try and explore. And that problem is this. Why is it that when we start to go back, way back in ancient times, we find that our ancient ancestors are never talking about very basic subjects that really should be part of their mythologies and legends? This is what I want to cover today, because I don't feel a lot of people realize that it is an issue in and of itself. And then, like I said, very few people take that even further and try to explore, the concepts that are simply missing from everything that our ancestors are talking about. One of those subjects that, for whatever reason, does not exist until a very particular point in history would be the existence of the moon. Now, what I mean by that is when you go as far back as you can kind of go with respect to all of the ancient mythologies and legends, we find a time period to where the moon is not being talked about at all. Like zero moon. I get it. You're probably saying something like, well, I mean, the moon is just always there. It doesn't really do anything. Why would anybody talk about it? Here's the problem. Our ancestors do nothing but talk about all this insane stuff going on up in the sky. So it gets really weird when we look really far back. We find a situation to where the moon is never mentioned. What makes the situation even more weird is that our ancestors have no problem talking about planets like Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, Mars, Venus, etc. Right? All of those planets, yep, right there. And they're in the histories. Not only are all of those planets in the ancient histories, but they play huge roles, right? I mean, Saturn plays a huge role. Saturn literally plays the creator role. Jupiter, another role. It's the second sun role that it plays. Anyway, all of the planets, for some weird reason, in our ancestors' past, all play huge mega roles. But there is one planetoid that is not there, and that is the moon. For whatever reason, the moon is never talked about during these stories. Now, before we go further, really quick, it's important that we separate some time periods here. The kinds of histories that I am talking about are the ones that go way back to the creation and a little after creation. It's very important to differentiate that. Now, I get it, there are going to be people who can rightfully point to certain cultures and say, hey, look, the moon is there during their creation mythology, right? And you can do that. Like, I acknowledge that. However, this would be my next challenge to that particular story. I would ask the people who hold on to that, I would ask them to double check and make sure that those ancient stories are truly ancient and are truly the originals, and that they are not referencing a different story of creation. Really quick, this is not part of this video, but really fast. Remember, in a lot of cultures, there are multiple points of what we would call creation, right? There's not just one creation in a lot of mythologies and then everything just goes. There are multiple creations, right? There's the concept of cycles in certain religions. In the Vedic stories, we have, I believe it's 9 different creations, right? They have their own cycle system, and right now we're in the Kali Yuga, the worst time to be alive, and I think we can all agree that we are definitely in the Kali Yuga. But anyways, it's very important to remember that when I'm talking about a creation story, we have to differentiate which part or which creation story we are talking about, even within a single religion or mythos. So actually, let me use this opportunity to lock that down. So when we look back in the past, we find all kinds of creation stuff the one I want to focus on would be the creation where essentially there was a let there be light type of situation. Like, this is where humanity kind of as we know it now kicks off. Because remember, humans like we are now are, according to our ancestors, different from what they were before a very particular event that is generally titled creation. And in fact, if you really want to get down to the semantics, I'm using the word creation, but I'm only using that word because that is basically the word that has been ascribed to all of these, to all of these stories. The funny part is, though, like, how many creations can you have, right? And that's the issue. So what we are going to be dealing with will be the let there be light version of the creation story. This is not creation in the sense of this is where humans officially came into existence. This would be the creation of where we are now, of our current situation that we are involved in. It's important to make this distinction because there's another creation story that supersedes the one that we are talking about now, which I suppose would also call into question the moon, because those stories also do not factor in the moon either. Right? Anyway, so you see what I'm saying? Basically, since there are multiple points of creation, depending on which mythology you are looking into, me using the word creation gets kind of weird. For those of you who are into catastrophism, this would be where Saturn novas. This would be this particular event. For those of you who are more religious, like-minded, right? I already said it, but this is the let there be light period. This would be the downfall of the golden age that all of our ancestors say that humans used to exist in. So I guess maybe creation is probably not the best verbiage for this, but it's the one that mainstream people use, or that most people are familiar with. So I'll just use that. Anyway, it doesn't even matter. Basically, what we're going to talk about is why do we find certain, major aspects of human life missing from all of these ancient stories. Now, there's a couple of perspectives we need to cover just so we understand the actual problem, and then we'll get into the information. But one of the things that mainstream people might come back with, or just anybody, your average person, like if I make the claim, hey, nobody is talking about the moon during this particular time period, even though they're talking about Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, Venus, etc., for whatever reason the moon is not present, you could shoot back and say, well, yeah, but I mean, the moon is just there, bro. I mean, it's there all the time. When was the last time you sat there and talked about the moon when you were making up a story? You can make that assertion, and it's not a bad one. And I'll give credit to that assertion, but I would fire back, does that really make sense? By that I mean, if our ancestors really were stupid monkey people running around, thousands of years ago, and they didn't comprehend basic anything, according to the mainstream, why is it that we find that they have no problem worshiping things like Saturn and Jupiter, but for whatever reason, the moon does not factor into any of their ancient histories? It really does not make any sense when you think about it longer than 3 seconds. Because if people were primitive, I mean, how the hell are primitive people tracking planets and then ascribing all of these crazy dramas and feats to these little points of light in the sky? Because remember, that's all that in theory our ancestors should have seen. If we go by what the mainstream believes and the theory of uniformity and all of that trash, the reality is the people who were making up these stories back in the day, they should have seen essentially the exact same night sky that you and I see right now. But if they were looking at the same night sky, it really does beg the question, why are these guys talking about Saturn doing all this crazy stuff, or Mars doing all this crazy stuff? I mean, really, at the end of the day, why are the ancients wasting their time with any of these little specks of dots of light on the night sky and calling them gods in any sense of the term? If you look up right now at the night sky, do you look up and see Mars and think, wow, that's really the god of war. I really feel like I need to go and fight. No! 99% of the people on this planet right now probably could not even point out Mars if you paid them. right? If we go out to the night sky with your average person and I say, hey, dude, point to Mars really quick, and then tell me how that little dot of light makes you feel. Right? We're not even going to get to the second part of my question because the person is never even going to find Mars. So at the end of the day, it begs the question, why the hell did our ancestors worship any of these planets? And then, of course, it asks the next question, which we are going to talk about finally today, eventually. Why are none of our ancient ancestors talking about the moon or worshiping the moon during a very particular time in ancient history? I mean, think about it, right? If you're an ancient primitive person, and if I show you the starry night sky and I say, all right, pick your god, bro, what do you want to worship? Are you going to be like, oh, you know what? I think I'm going to pick that little point of light out there amongst all the other points of light, and I'm going to, I don't know, magically know it's a planet, and I'm going to ascribe all these crazy stories to it. No one is going to say that. Every single person is going to say, oh yeah, the moon. Why? Because the moon is in the sky. It's a goddamn planet sitting right there, and it's, it's truly crazy if you think about it. I know nowadays we take the moon for granted, and that would basically be probably what most people would say is the reason why none of the ancestors really talk about it, but that just doesn't make psychological sense, right? If you're going to worship a god is generally something that means something, that has an effect, right? The moon is a giant goddamn planet. It's in the sky right there. You can see the craters. It's amazing, right? You can't see, Mars. Why the hell would you worship Mars? I mean, seriously. Why would you ever stop and be like, you know what? I'm going to worship that point of light and it's totally the god of war, bro. And it's just not happening. Nobody is doing that. It's dumb, right? But this is what the mainstream thinks, right? Or did I don't know. Did I even say what I was going to say? My main point there, I guess, was going to be that the mainstream would just say, the moon is there all the time. Everybody takes it for granted. So that's why they didn't talk about it. And you can argue that, and that argument would probably satiate most people, but it doesn't make sense psychologically, especially if you decide to work within the framework of how mainstream looks at humanity back in the day, right? If everybody is a primitive person, they're going to pick the moon. They are not going to pick the little ball of light. It doesn't make sense. It literally makes no sense that anybody would be worshiping planets, and it certainly doesn't make sense that they would make all of their creation stories dealing with those planetary bodies. Where the hell is the moon? You would think that the moon might play, I don't know, maybe a small role. You think maybe somebody would be like, oh yeah, and the moon was there too. Right? Nobody even says that. We don't even get like a little addendum. Like nobody does anything like that. Why is that? Right? That's the real question. Why is it that when we look at these cultures, there's no moon? Right? So if there's no moon, what does that mean? So this is what I want to explore today. So let's look at it right now using critical thinking. If our ancestors are not talking about a moon, then we can possibly believe that there was no moon to talk about. Right? That is a direct deduction that we can get out of the information that we have. Now, for your average person, I get it. No moon, what are you talking about, bro? Because I'm talking about only, 6, 7, 10, 12,000 years ago that Earth had no moon. It is entirely possible that the moon is a relatively recent object orbiting Earth. That's the claim. I mean, and that claim is coming from pure evidence, deduction, etc. I did not go across the street and rob the crack house and tell him, give me crack so I can make up some sort of crazy moon conspiracy that the moon never existed and then it existed and then blah, blah, blah. Like, I did not do that. I did not go and rob the crack house across the street. It never happened, right? People who are coming to this conclusion that the moon may very well be a newer addition to Earth is born from the evidence that our ancestors have left us. Even more interesting, we can actually look at the scientific and geologic evidence, and we can actually start to prove that the moon is indeed a newer foreign body that our ancestors at a certain point in time had no idea of its existence because it didn't exist. It wasn't there. It's simple, right? You don't talk about the moon in all of your major space stories because there's no moon. For whatever reason, our ancestors have no problem, even though they're supposed to be monkeys, they have no problem tracking the orbits of Saturn, Jupiter, all those other planets. But for whatever reason, they just decided that the moon was not special enough. Those little dots in the sky, those are the real gods. That giant planetoid that hovers over your head every night, it's irrelevant, bro. Don't worry about it. We don't talk about it. It's stupid. It's dumb. It's the moon. We don't need it's just garbage. We need to worship that tiny little point of light out there, and that's what we're gonna do. Right? It doesn't make sense. Do you see what I'm saying? Like it's dumb, right? If our ancestors are not talking about something, then there's no reason to suppose that it is there. Now, I know you can get semantical with me and argue with me on certain points of that, but I'm just focusing on like their stories dealing with like the gods and creation. You would think that the moon would exist as probably a large point of the story, actually, considering its place in the sky, relative to Saturn. Saturn is a point of light. Like, why would you blame Saturn on the creation of this particular period of time when the moon is right there? Right? It makes no sense. It's like common sense is dead in society, and that's what makes me want to slap people. You just want to go out and you just want, okay. Anyway, so let's deal with that, right? This is a very real problem, and to make matters even more interesting, it's not like there's just one culture that talks about no moon, or not talks about, that does not have a moon in their history. There's countless cultures that have a point in their history to where the moon simply does not exist. It plays no role. It's not there. What gets even crazier is that as you go through these stories, these histories, these legends, whatever you want to call them, suddenly you start to find stories at a very particular point in the chronological time frame within those histories to where the moon shows up. Yeah, our ancestors actually have stories about the moon being put into Earth's orbit. And it was not in Earth's orbit, 10,000 plus years ago, according to our ancestors. Now, it's really important to understand, I don't have real dates for any of this stuff. So right now in my studies of chronology, basically chronology has pointed out that we don't know jack crap about anything with respect to dating. So I have no dates to give you guys. I'm just gonna say that outright. I don't know. I have no clue when the moon arrived. I have no clue how long of a span there was between the Saturn nova and when the moon may have arrived. I have no idea. And so far as I have been able to tell, nobody else has good dates either. And that's just the situation. I mean, if anybody out there actually has sources with real dates, and they are backed up by real evidence, real science, etc., I would love to see them. I just have not found them personally. So I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm just saying that if I am scientifically honest with you, I don't have a date. So whenever I give you guys a little bit of dates here or there, you'll probably hear me say like 10,000-ish years ago. That just means that it's going to be maybe around that time period. But the ultimate thing to take away from any ish date that I give you is that these are relatively recent time periods, right? The Saturn nova event was not millions of years ago, right? It may have not even been 10,000 years ago. I don't know, but it's relatively recent in human history, because that's what the science shows, right? There's no way around that. I don't know what else to tell people when they try to say something like, oh yeah, the Earth is 4 billion years old and humans have been around for 100 or 200,000 years and, blah, blah, blah. The reality is the scientific evidence supports none of that, right? The stratigraphical evidence does not support it. The geological evidence does not nothing supports any of these claims, right? So if you think that me saying something like, this only happened 10,000 years ago, or the moon only entered Earth's orbit like 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, right? That might sound insane initially, but these deductions are based on the hard truths of science, right? We're not playing favorites. We're just looking at the evidence. and the evidence does not support those kinds of long time periods of existence for humans. It's funny, to make matters even worse, a uniformitarianist, they should expect to find tons of evidence, because remember, if everything takes 10 billion years to happen, there should be ungodly amounts of evidence to prove all of their extended dates. And it's just not there, right? It does not exist. And it doesn't matter how they feel about it. It's not there. Okay, so anyway, moving on. All right, so I don't have good dates, right? And like I said, nobody else does either. So don't jump on me and start trying to slap me, okay? I'm being honest. All right, so we have a problem. When we look back in history, we have a situation to where our ancestors talk about times that do not include the moon. And it's weird because our ancestors are constantly talking about all kinds of planetary stuff happening, cosmological events, but the moon plays no role in any of these events until eventually it shows up. For example, there's an entire people called the Pelagians, or however you want to pronounce them, right? Those people are literally called the people before the moon. And when people would refer to them, it wasn't like some sort of a mystical reference or like some sort of a religious thing. It was a matter of fact reference, right? The people, the further back you go, you find a situation to where people knew there was no moon, a little while ago. It wasn't weird to them. Like, they had the moon at that period in their life, but they knew that there was no moon in the past, and it didn't matter. It was just like, yeah, we understand that that's how things went. Our ancestors told us that, the moon showed up, a few hundred years ago, or whatever time period you're talking about, and people moved on with life, right? There's no big deal about it because it was just a matter of fact. And that is not taken seriously when historians look at these stories, right? They just write all of this stuff off as feats of fancy, which is dumb because, okay, all right, I'm done complaining. All right, let's go. So we have to start somewhere, and I figure let's start with Velikovsky. Velikovsky actually went out of his way to approach this problem because as he was doing his historical research to put together what he would eventually, write in Worlds in Collision and from there on other stuff, what he noticed was that there is indeed a period in time to where no moon is mentioned. So from his perspective, I'm not like talking for Velikovsky, I'm just, saying what may have happened. Anyway, the way things were looking at, he was putting together this whole cosmological timeline of all the planets doing all this crazy stuff, but the moon is not present for a good chunk of it. The moon does indeed show up eventually, but the moon plays no role in the earlier points of the history. So, that's a serious problem, and that's what I want to expose to you guys to expose. That's what I want to go over today with you guys. Let's see what evidence Velikovsky found. We'll just start with him, and then, over the course of this channel, we'll start to bring other points of evidence to light. And let's see if we can't actually figure out at what point in time the moon shows up and enters the orbit that it has now. Really quick, for those of you who are, physics oriented, well, you should already have a problem with the moon as it is, right? I mean, it's funny, even mainstream cosmology has huge problems with the existence of the moon in the way that it exists today. I won't belabor the point, but if you go and do a fast ClearNet search, you will find cosmologists questioning why the moon is where it is right now and how the hell it has the orbit that it has. So there's actually a serious problem in cosmology relative to the moon's existence because the moon's orbit doesn't make sense as a captured body. Now, for mainstream scientists who snort soy all day, right, they will immediately point out and say, hey, look, this computer simulation shows that the moon, that's how the moon formed and that's how it got into the orbit it got into, right? But the simulations themselves are specifically designed to have that exact outcome. When you use real simulations and you let the simulations just go, it is impossible right now under any current mainstream theory to achieve the current orbit that the moon has. It just doesn't work it's from a physics perspective. And I mean a real physics perspective, not dark energy, dark matter garbage. I mean from an actual physics perspective, the moon's current orbit is impossible. Right, and that's just a fact. The three-body problem is a reality when you're trying to deal with the creation or the capture of the moon. There's nothing we can do to get around that relative to physics. It's a serious problem, and the fact that the moon achieved its almost circular orbit around the Earth makes zero sense. I mean, it makes zero sense in the context of the mainstream anyway. But to mainstream's credit, there are indeed a lot of astronomers and cosmologists out there who realize that the moon's existence is a severe problem. And I can't understate that enough. It's really weird. The moon's very existence, in the way that it exists right now, I mean, it's insane. Right? And any cosmologist that has any brain cells at all to rub together, they know this. And a lot have admitted it, but many more will not. Now, I also realize that there are going to be people out there who are going to say something like, but life could never have existed without the moon. The moon has to have been in orbit around the Earth for, 4 or 5 billion years, or whatever the hell they say nowadays. Prove it. Seriously, prove to me 100% scientifically that this is the case. I'll spare you some time. We have no proof that this is the case. There is zero reason to believe that life on this planet requires a moon. Like zero. This is simply a mainstream scientific religious dogma situation. There's no reason to believe that a moon is required for life. All right, Anyway, let's get into Velikovsky and let's see what he dug up when he started to explore the problem of the Earth without the moon. The period when the Earth was moonless is probably the most remote recollection of mankind. Democritus and Anaxagoras taught that there was a time when the Earth was without the moon. Aristotle wrote that Arcadia in Greece, before being inhabited by the Hellenes, had a population of Pelagians, and that these aborigines occupied the land already before there was a moon in the sky above the Earth. For this reason, they were called Proselenists. Now, of course, we have to be careful with stuff from, say, Aristotle, because we now have evidence that a lot of this stuff may have been written or created entirely during the Renaissance period. So that kind of gives a different spin on sources, on ancient Greek sources, right? And I'm pretty sure that Velikovsky is going to use them. So anyway, just something to keep in mind that, and this is a problem that I have right now in my studies, because it's tough to use something like Aristotle to support something else, simply because we now know that it is entirely possible that whoever Aristotle was did not live in ancient Greece, but lived during the Renaissance. Anyway, let's keep going. All right, I won't belabor that point. Apollonius of Rhodes mentioned the time when, quote, when not all the orbs were yet in the heavens, before the Danai of Deucalion races came into existence, and only the Arcadians lived, of whom it is said that they dwelt on mountains and fed on acorns before there was a moon, unquote. Plutarch wrote in the Roman Questions, quote, there were Arcadians of Evander's following, the so-called pre-lunar people. Similarly, wrote Ovid, the Arcadians are said to have possessed their land before the birth of Jove, and the folk is older than the moon. Hippolytus refers to a legend that, quote, Arcadia brought forth Pelasgus, of greater antiquity than the moon, unquote. Lucian, in his astrology, says that, quote, the Arcadians affirm in their folly that they are older than the moon, unquote. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if, yeah, okay. Censorinus also alludes to the time in the past where there was no moon in the sky. Some allusions to the time before there was a moon may be found also in the scriptures. I know, scriptures, but I hate to say it, but religious texts, they do matter to history. I know that, nowadays it's really uncool to, look at religious texts in a manner that allows you, or in a way that you would take them seriously. Let's put it like that. And because modern day people, especially modern researchers, are now of the opinion, more or less, not everybody, but most researchers nowadays really do just completely exclude religious texts. And the reason why they do that is simple. In the Western world nowadays, if you take any of these texts seriously at all, you are immediately labeled a creationist or something like that, right? You're some sort of a religious nut job. The reality is, religious texts, they're historical documents, right? It doesn't matter if every single sentence in these documents are fiction, they were still written in the past. So since that's the case, that immediately makes all of these religious texts important to one degree or another. So when we start finding the possibility of no moon existing in these texts, well, your average person immediately will not even notice that, probably. But if they do notice it, they're not going to care because they're just going to think that, it's all garbage anyways, so there's no information to get out of it. But that's not really the case. The reality is that when we look at these religious texts, and we find things like, hey, there's time periods where there is no moon, and then hell, we even find, situations to where these texts will talk about a story where the moon came from, right? And from an eyewitness testimony, by the way, these people are not writing in the sense of, some mystical, weird, invisible narrator. No, these people, when they were recording these supposed religious texts, right, they were writing from a perspective of, hey, I saw this happen, and here is what we saw. Like that is the perspective in a lot of religious texts. So Velikovsky, he's Jewish, and so he's really into the biblical chronology. That's probably one of the biggest weaknesses of Velikovsky. But, all the other stuff that he brings up, it's legit. He's just recording what he found from other cultures, which is why I wanted to talk about it. You get my point. All right, let's keep going. In Job 25:5, the grandeur of the Lord who, quotes, makes peace in the heights, unquote, is praised, and the time is mentioned, quote, before there was a moon and it did not shine, unquote. Also, in Psalm 72:5, it is said, quote, thou wast fierce since the time of the sun, and before the time of the moon, a generation of generations, unquote. A, quote, generation of generations, unquote, means a very long time. Of course, it is of no use to counter this psalm with the myth of the first chapter of Genesis, a tale brought down from exotic and later sources. The memory of a world without a moon lives on in oral tradition among the Indians. The Indians of the Bogata Highlands in the eastern Cordilleras of Colombia relate some of their tribal reminiscences to the time before there was a moon. Quote, in the earliest times when the moon was not yet in the heavens, unquote, say the tribesmen of Chibchas. Chibchas, that's a cool name, Chibchas. I gotta name something like Chibcha. There are currently 3 theories of the origin of the moon. 1. The moon originated at the same time as the Earth, being formed substantially from the same material, aggregating and solidifying. 2. The moon was formed not in the vicinity of the Earth, but in a different part of the solar system, and was later captured by the Earth. 3. The moon was originally a portion of the terrestrial crust and was torn out, leaving behind the bed of the Pacific. Okay, so interesting to note that basically there are really still no new moon creation theories, by the way. Remember, Velikovsky wrote this, well, I mean, it had to have been before the 80s, no matter what. Anyway, so this would have been an older writing. So even back then, they only had a few ideas of where the moon may have come from. And think about it nowadays. I mean, what do we still have? We still have these same basic concepts, except for the third one. But so the first one was, the moon originated at the same time of the Earth, being formed of the same stuff, right? So that's probably going to be embedded in the accretion model. The accretion model is absolute garbage, by the way. There is no scientific substance to that model whatsoever, and it has 0 successful predictions to its name. So we can get rid of that garbage. The second one, he says, the moon was formed not in the vicinity of the Earth, but in a different part, and then was captured. That sounds all well and good until you look at the very, very basic physics of the situation. And then you have to start asking, how the hell did the Earth capture the moon? The moon, first of all, is not that small. I mean, the moon is a decent-sized body, right? And so, I mean, relative to the Earth, it may initially seem at first like, oh yeah, no problem. The Earth could capture the moon. It's just not an issue, bro. Don't worry about it. Of course, the moon could be captured. But the question of how the Earth could capture a body like the moon gets really weird, because you need a way to get the moon to A, slow down enough to where the Earth can capture it, and then you have to somehow get the moon into an almost perfectly circular orbit after it's being caught. So there's a couple of problems here. So the first problem is just trying to grab the moon in the first place. The way people look at orbital mechanics, your average person, not people who are into it, people who are into physics and stuff, they know this, it's just not really talked about. But you need to get a way to slow the moon down so that the Earth can actually, capture it. Something has to put the brakes on. Now, the problem is that in space, there's no brakes to be put on, and to make matters worse, the Earth's gravity is nowhere near strong enough to put the brakes on the size of a body of the moon, right? The Earth, I mean, whatever, if you go off of the mainstream explanation, they never touch this, by the way, which is funny, or they have to inject all these weird parameters, but to get the moon into the orbit that we see right now, the amount of theoretical variables that you have to create to get the moon to land in the situation that it currently is in is astounding. I mean, you might as well just say God did it, because that is going to be a better explanation than all the garbage that a mainstream cosmologist has to put out there to get the mechanics, the orbital mechanics of the moon to work. Because the Earth capturing the moon, you have to, okay, you get my point. Anyways, that's beyond the scope of this discussion. But the point stands, and we'll have to do a show on that later. Okay, and then what's the third thing that he mentions, which it's interesting that he does mention this theory at all, where it says the moon was originally a portion of the terrestrial crust and was torn out, leaving behind the bed of the Pacific. Not many people are probably too familiar with this theory. And I mean, to be honest, calling it a theory is probably a little too generous for this. So back in the day, a guy named Chan Thomas, he wrote a book called The Adam and Eve Story. Anyway, that book essentially postulates that other moon-like bodies had slammed into planet Earth, and our ancestors saw these collisions, like an actual something larger than the moon right now is what he claims hit Earth, and then of course all that material spread out, and then it became the moon, etc. The only reason why I mention that is because I'm surprised that Velikovsky even puts it in his work at all. All right, I'm not going to dwell on this. We'll just keep going. But the reason why I wanted to just go over those really quick was just to highlight that really not much has changed in science barring the Chan Thomas thing. Not a whole lot has changed with respect to where the hell the moon came from, right? Scientists have no idea where the moon came from. I mean, it's hilarious how it was formed, why it's in Earth's orbit. Like I said earlier, the fact that the moon is in the orbit it is in is absolutely insane. I mean, it's just basically any student of physics can immediately, or should be immediately, distressed by the mainstream explanation of the moon's orbit. I mean, it's absolute. Okay, I'm just ranting now. I know. All right, I'll shut up. Okay, let's keep going. All three theories claim the presence of the moon on an orbit around the Earth for billions of years. Mythology may supply each of these views with some support. Genesis 1 for the first view, the birth of Aphrodite from the sea from the third view, Aphrodite's origin in the disruption of Uranus, and also the violence of sin, the Babylonian moon, seems to support the second view. The Aphrodite aspect of this is actually fairly interesting, because Aphrodite, Velikovsky came to the conclusion that Aphrodite was the moon. Now, this is not a universal conclusion. So when you go and you start reading these mythologies that deal with Aphrodite, and there's a lot of stuff out there, one of the things that is not clear precisely is who Aphrodite actually was in the sky. I only want to say this really fast. I can't clear it up because I don't know truly who the hell Aphrodite was. But just something to think about. So Velikovsky took the camp of saying, yes, the moon was Aphrodite, and he presents all kinds of evidence for that. I don't know. We may have talked about it. I don't know. I'm sure we'll eventually get to it on this channel. But there's another camp that believes that Aphrodite was actually Venus. Yeah, you like that? Nice dichotomy. So we've got Aphrodite possibly being the moon, or possibly being Venus. The real question is, why the hell is there even a confusion on who Aphrodite could actually be? And before you start shouting at me saying, oh, we already know who Aphrodite is, blah, blah, blah. The scientific, historical reality is we don't have that locked down. We don't have that figured out. I just wanted to point that out to everybody so that, actually it's pretty important when it comes to catastrophism, because some of the stuff that goes on, especially in the Iliad, for example, right? So if you use the Iliad, the moon in that case, from Velikovsky's point of view, was Aphrodite. And when we have the recountings of what is going on up in the sky with the gods, with Zeus, Pallas Athene, Ares, etc. All the gods up there slapping each other around and stuff like that. If we put that those scenes in the context of not gods but planets, obviously certain, everything changes. But one of the interesting things of note is that the descriptions are very interesting of the gods, because the gods are doing things like chasing each other or going after one another. And you can easily imagine watching, or not watching, I guess you could watch, pervert thing. Anyway, you could easily imagine a night sky to where our ancestors, in this particular instance, it would have been the Trojan War people, they would have been looking up at the sky and describing these movements of the gods. So when Zeus, Jupiter says that Pallas Athene and Ares can go fight each other, and then, Aphrodite goes after them, if you read that in the context of just god garbage, then, it's like, whatever, fine, they're just doing their god thing, it doesn't matter. But if you attach planets to all of those names, suddenly we now have planetary bodies moving around and being affected by each other's gravity or electromagnetic fields, right? So you would see attractions, or you would see repulsions. It changes everything. Anyway, one of the confusing aspects, like I said, I have no answer for this. I'm trying to figure that one out too. Is who the hell really was Aphrodite? Was Aphrodite the moon? Because if Aphrodite was the moon, that means at some point during the Trojan War, they watched the moon's orbit shift and start to go away from the Earth, right? And then, of course, Zeus says no, and then the moon comes back. Why does Jupiter get the credit for that? I don't know. Like, I don't know exactly what happened. But these are the kinds of discrepancies that we start to find when we're reading history. So actually, the main point from all that babbling is just remember, we actually do not have like everything locked down in mythology, which means there's plenty of room for you and maybe me, if I ever get smart, to actually, decode and figure out what our ancestors were truly talking about when it comes to various planetary bodies. A side note, I know I'm ranting, but a side note is this: if all of that catastrophism stuff is real, it's also possible that planetary bodies that are no longer in existence were being described in these stories as well. And they could be confused with other planetary bodies, say, for example, the moon. So just something to think about, all right? Okay, let's keep going. Since mankind on both sides of the Atlantic preserved the memory of a time when the Earth was without the moon, the first hypothesis, namely of the moon originating simultaneously with the Earth and in its vicinity, is to be excluded, leaving the other two hypotheses to compete between themselves. Hypotheses? Is it hypotheses? Hypothesis? I don't know. We have seen that the traditions of diverse peoples offer corroborative testimony to the effect that in a very early age, but still in the memory of mankind, no moon accompanied the Earth. Since human beings already peopled the Earth, it is improbable that the moon sprang from it. There must have existed a solid lithosphere, not a liquid Earth. Thus, while I do not claim to know the origin of the moon, I find it more probable that the moon was captured by the Earth. Such an event would have occurred as a catastrophe. If the moon's formation took place away from the Earth, its composition may be quite different. Now, that is sound logic, right? There's nothing to really argue about that. But what I would say, just to say it to be devil's advocate, is that just because two planetary bodies are composed of similar material, that does not necessarily mean that they formed in a similar area and in a similar time. This does not necessarily have to be the truth. I'm just throwing it out there as just a critical thinking point, because we do have to stay objective in all of this stuff, right? So just because something seems like it could have been there, and okay, anyway, it doesn't even matter. I don't even know why I brought this up. Let's keep reading. Where were we at? There is no evidence to suggest whether the moon was a planet, a satellite of another planet, or a comet at the time of its capture by the Earth. Whatever atmosphere it may have had was pulled away by the Earth, by other contacting bodies, or dissipated in some other way. Now, this is actually one of probably the more important points in this small article. The atmosphere question about the moon. So check this out. The moon, the way it looks right now, it more than likely did not look like this back in the day when our ancestors first saw it enter the orbit. What do I mean? So right now, when we look up at the moon, we see all kinds of craters, right? I mean, the moon is essentially a barren wasteland of craters and, canyons and shelves. It's just, there's nothing there. It looks like it has been absolutely destroyed. Now, the interesting part is when we go back into mythologies from a lot of people that deal with the moon showing up and then dealing with what the moon does, we find a situation to where the moon actually starts to take the brunt of quite a few electrical discharges. Now, our ancestors didn't see all of them, of course, but it sounds like there were like some pretty mega events to where another planetary body was indeed flying by Earth and the moon when the moon was there. And it sounds like the moon actually may have protected Earth from some of the more serious catastrophes that Earth could have fallen prey to if the moon was not there. So one of my problems when we look back, through chronology and mythology and all of this stuff is, we find all these gods up in the sky. And like I said earlier, we do not have a true accounting for all of them with respect to cosmological bodies. So it's entirely possible, for example, that the moon could have looked different and had a particular name while it looked different. For example, maybe it had a different atmosphere, or it had a thicker atmosphere, which would have given it a different look. If it wasn't completely scarred yet, the moon would have looked completely different. So this may actually cause confusion in ancient texts, because there might be a period to where the moon is given one name and described in a very particular way. But the description of the moon, or the way it looked to them back in the day, will not match what we see today. So this is an actual real problem. It's actually a problem that goes beyond the moon, because the reality is, back during the time when all the planets were trying to get into their current orbits now, they were going through all kinds of crazy events, and all of these crazy catastrophic events literally altered the planets. It altered their physical crust, it altered their color, and it absolutely would have altered their atmospheres. And this, of course, would then lead to our ancestors potentially describing a completely different version of the moon. But now, us today, we look at these descriptions and they don't match what we see. And to make matters even worse, if you factor in the widespread use of the theory of uniformity, then that means everybody has it in their head that the moon has been in its current position looking like it does right now, not for just thousands of years, but hundreds of millions, if not billions of years. Basically, if we are going to use our current perception of the moon, the way we see it right now in the sky, and we are just going to assume that it looked just like this, just thousands of years ago or hundreds of millions of years ago, there's a good chance that we will never decode what some of our ancestors are talking about. So just keep that in mind when you are reading ancient texts or doing whatever you're doing with respect to the possibility of dealing with planetary gods, is that you might actually be reading a text dealing with the moon, but because it's being described as doing something completely different and looking different, you're never going to make the connection. So just remember to keep an open mind. And that goes for all of the planets, right? I mean, for example, Saturn, the way Saturn looks right now, Saturn did not look like that like 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. It did not have rings, for example, nor was it surrounded by all of the cloud formations that currently wrap around the entire, planet of Saturn. None of those things existed back in the day. So our ancestors won't describe certain features that we right now relegate to very specific planetary bodies. What's even more interesting is that when we read these texts or we listen to these stories, we actually find a situation to where our ancestors are recounting how, for example, Saturn got its rings. And when Saturn got its rings, right? Same thing with Jupiter. They describe how Jupiter went from potentially it was another brown dwarf star, and then of course it shrank over time, and then it also got its current planetary features. Anyway, so on topic of the moon, it's entirely possible that our ancestors were describing the moon taking part in all of this cosmological situation happening up in the sky, and we are misreading the texts because we don't recognize the moon like our ancestors saw it back in the day. Yeah, that was a long-winded way to... Anyway, just watch out for that crap. Just keep an open mind when you're reading. I don't care what ancient text it is. Just keep that in mind. Remember, their environment, our ancestors' environment, thousands and thousands of years ago, was completely different. And I mean through and through. Oxygen content was different. Life was different. The Earth's orbit was... everything was different. So keep that in mind when you are reading those texts. Okay, I know, I'm just like talking. Okay, let's keep going. Since the time the moon began to accompany the Earth, it underwent the influence of contacts with comets and planets that passed near the Earth in subsequent ages. Okay, here we go. The mass of the moon being less than that of Earth, the moon must have suffered greater disturbances in cosmic contacts. During these contacts, the moon was not carried away. This is due to the fact that no body more powerful than the Earth came sufficiently close to the moon to take it away from the Earth for good. But in the contacts that took place, the moon was removed repeatedly from one orbit to another. Yeah, this is also important. Think about this. So when we look back in the past, there is a particular point in history to where, for whatever reason, all of a sudden cultures start using the moon as a calendar. So what that gives us is that gives us a real scientific point of reference. If we can find and really identify the point at which the lunar calendar, the first lunar calendars, start to take hold, then we can actually start to understand the exact moment, or at least essentially the last time that the moon was ever really messed with. Now, the lunar calendar is a whole other problem in and of itself, because right now the moon is not a perfect 30 days around the Earth. But back in the day, all of our ancestors, or during a very particular time in history, our ancestors did use an exact 30-day calendar. So this begs the question, so what was the moon at some point in a true 30-day orbit around the Earth? This is a possibility. When we look at the calendar system that used a 30-day, moon calendar, we don't find any of our ancestors complaining about having to offset days until a later point in history. By all accounts, when the lunar calendar is created and put into use by civilizations, nobody is worried about intercalary periods. Nobody is worried about trying to put in leap days or leap nights or whatever the hell, because the calendar would not go off. The calendar was accurate, right? And that's a completely different show. It's not in the scope of this. But what we could do is we could do this. If we can pinpoint the exact time when the lunar calendar starts being used, and I don't mean using mainstream chronology. Mainstream chronology is not going to help us. We have to throw all of that in the garbage. But if we can figure out when the lunar calendar truly first comes into use, then that's a good safe bet that at that point, that would have been essentially the last time the moon was ever shifted from its orbit. And if we can figure that out, that would be a huge chunk of the puzzle, not only just to trying to figure out, bits about the moon or civilizations as well, but we could actually use that in reference to see when the last time any of these planetary contacts happened. And then that will really set the stage and really help explain what the hell is going on with humanity and what we see and why we see what we see here on Earth and in the solar system. Like, that would be, it'd be crazy. So that's something we actually, so if you can do that, bam, you got, you're hired, not by me, I don't have any money, but you're hired by somebody, but there's an opportunity. That's what I love, is there are all of these opportunities to make discoveries, like real, fresh discoveries. Right, nowadays, most people have been so put off from even trying to do stuff because, as far as most people are concerned, is that all the discoveries have essentially been made, and you're not allowed to make a new discovery. So this is like a perfect opportunity. If anybody can figure this out. Okay, we're almost done with the article, and I'll start complaining and whatever. Okay. The variations in the position of the moon can be read in the variations of the length of the month. Oh, he's going to talk about it. Okay. The length of the month repeatedly changed in subsequent catastrophic events. And for this, there exists a large amount of supporting evidence. In these later occurrences, the moon played a passive role, and Zeus in the Iliad advised it, Aphrodite, to stay out of the battle in which Athene and Ares, Venus and Mars, were the main contestants. All right, so basically he just said what I started saying. But it's true. So one of the things that we find when we look back in the past, and this is what I was talking about, is that the lunar calendar starts out strong, perfect, and it's useful and it works. And then it changes, right? We have the same problem with the sun calendar as well. Different topic, obviously. But if we can pinpoint, like really get the details on when these changes occurred, and really lock those down, that gives us an insight into what was going on cosmologically. And if we can figure that out, that's just a huge piece of the puzzle, because then we can look at all kinds of cultures all over the world and start to compare that information with what they're talking about, and then we can better situate their chronology in a real chronology. Like, it's, man, the opportunities, it's crazy. Like, there's so much that we could do right now. Anyway, so that's Velikovsky's take, and that's just off of his or I don't know if it's his, it's the Velikovsky archive. I'll put the link in the description for you guys. There's a lot of good stuff, and we'll keep going through all the Velikovsky stuff. This channel's gonna be full of it if you haven't noticed. But the moon, the moon's a problem. People don't really think about that, but the fact that the moon is where it is now is almost impossible to explain scientifically without injecting all kinds of fantastical variables. Like I said, I'd actually respect scientists, or I do respect the scientists. They just come out and they say, I guess God did it, bro, because I don't got anything else. There's no other explanation that we currently have that explains why the moon is in the position that it is. I don't know, I guess a God did it, whatever. I don't even believe in a God or anything, but if a scientist were to say that, I would have more respect for them, because they're not just throwing in a bunch of random variable garbage, hoping that something eventually sticks in the mainstream public's eye, and then they can get promoted and do all their garbage in the academic world. So anyway, so that's the position that we're in with the moon. It's okay, you guys get it, right? Figure it out, because I want to know the answer, because I'm not smart enough to figure this stuff out. So go figure it out. You have been given your orders. Go before me and go and figure out when the moon was captured by Earth, or should I say, put in Earth's orbit. That's another thing too, right? The moon's orbit is so weird that it actually does have hallmarks of being placed there artificially. And that's a whole other ball of wax or whatever, but it's true. The moon's orbit is so weird that it makes sense to actually say that it was put there artificially by someone or something, rather than saying, yeah, bro, it got captured some magical way and whatever. Anyway, that doesn't work. The ironic part about all of the evidence that we have right now for the moon's existence in its current location is actually pointing more in an artificially placed direction. How do you like that? Like, if we just follow the true science of what we know right now, you can legitimately, scientifically, make the claim that the moon is indeed an artificial, I'm not saying it's an artificial body, but it's an artificially placed object for whatever reason to float around the Earth, right? And I know that gets into all kinds of crazy Anunnaki, Hollow Earth, crazy, whatever, space cowboy stuff, and people lose their minds and start snorting noodles. And I'm not going to get into it now, because we're going to stop talking about this, because I finished the article like 5 minutes ago and I'm still going. I'm done. All right, we'll do more later. We'll figure this shit out eventually.